Hey guys, welcome to Amity Tracks. This is the second video in our little two-video series on soundtracks. So if you missed the first video, I recommend checking that out because in that video I counted down my favorite 10 and then added some honorable mentions, like original scores, for films. Today's video is dealing with a different kind of soundtrack. And you know what I'm talking about. There are a lot of films that use just a bunch of different songs, right, for a movie. Sometimes it's a collection of old songs, previously released songs, which kind of brought together to you know create a mood for that film. Now sometimes the filmmaker will actually get some artists to write a new song for the film, and maybe some of that soundtrack is filled out with some of these new songs. Anyway, so this is like a collection of songs versus like a score. And a lot of these type of soundtracks, if they hit, can be big sellers, and in turn uh, bring more people to the film, right? So that's what we're looking at this time. Same deal. I'm going to count down my 10 favorite of this type of soundtrack, and I'll show you a few honorable mentions, just a few that barely didn't make it. And same deal as last time. In the comments, talk about ones that I didn't mention, of this type, or if you want to talk about the ones I did mention, that's great too. Now, I want to start with an honorable mention. I've got to mention Team America, World Police. Um, yeah, it's for the song, and Fourth of July was fairly recently. It's a patriotic song, America, F yeah. And then also I like the bummer remix when it's real slow. So honorable mention, Team America. All right, on a more serious note, my number 10. My number 10. Now this one kind of mood wise has a sound more like some of the stuff I was talking about in the last episode. Um, you know, kind of, I don't know, like Hans Zimmerish, Vangelis, that type of thing. But it really falls in this category because it's a collection of different artists, and some of these tracks were released before on different albums of those artists. So this is much more of like a compilation type uh, soundtrack. So this is where this falls. I used to be a big fan of this movie. I don't think it's aged that. I don't think it's as good as it. I don't know. As I thought it was when it came out. I still really like the music though. Talking about Heat, Michael Mann film from 1995. Remember, this was a big deal because while Al Pacino and Robert De Niro had been in the same film before, like Godfather Part 2, they were never on screen together until here. And that was the big deal, right? Yeah, Val Kilmer, Tom Sizemore, and some others. Now, I like this soundtrack because, again, it's very moody. It's a word I used a lot in the last video. Um, along the lines of Hans Zimmer or Vangelis, a lot of synthesizer stuff. But it's got some tracks from Moby, including "God Moving Over the Face of the Waters," which is a beautiful track by Moby, and it was used very well in this film. Um, who else? Let's see. Lisa Gerard, uh, Terja Ripdahl. I'm mispronouncing that, I know. Michael Brook, U2 and Brian Eno, from their Passengers album, a track called uh, Always Forever Now, which is actually really good. Kronos Quartet. Anyway, fits the film pretty well, so I like that one. Number 9, definitely kind of more in the tradition of what I'm talking about with this category here. A film from 1987. This movie was a massive deal when it came out. I still like it. I mean, there's been a lot more sort of realistic depictions of war since then. I remember at the time it was a big deal. Talking about Oliver Stone's Platoon, so the soundtrack to Platoon, and this is what I'm talking about. This does a really good job of picking a lot of songs of that era, that Vietnam era. A lot of these songs that a lot of the soldiers would have been listening to, overseas. And of course, it has that adagio for strings, the Elias's death scene. Um, hope I'm not spoiling the film, but 1987. You should have seen it by now. But yeah, just a lot of great soul. I mean, Tracks of My Tears from Smokey Robinson. Um, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, Otis Redding, Respect Aretha Franklin, When a Man Loved a Woman, Percy Sledge, Groovin' from the Rascals. But then also, stuff like Hello, I Love You by the Doors, White Rabbit from Jefferson Airplane, um, Okie from Muskogee from Merle Haggard. So kind of a nice little grab bag of songs that really sort of define that era. And again, I think kind of puts you in that time period, which is what these type of soundtracks that I'm talking about, where there's a collection of songs, should really do. Kind of evokes the film and the time period of the film, but also stands as a great listen, just as a great comp, right? That's kind of what these albums are. Number 8, going all the way back to 1969, so that era actually, but that's when this film came out, and talking about the soundtrack to Easy Rider. And this is one of the early examples of what we're talking about, bringing these songs together. There's a couple of Steppenwolf songs on here. I mean, obviously, this is one of the ultimate biker films, right? So, Born to Be Wild, one of the ultimate biker songs. And then The Pusher, which is probably my favorite Steppenwolf song. It's so good. It's kind of interesting. I remember the background on this. They wanted to use The Weight by the band, but they couldn't get the rights to it. So there's a cover by Smith, whoever that is, does a cover of The Weight instead of the actual band's version of The Weight being on here. The Birds, Wasn't Born to Follow is great. If 6 Was 9 from Jimi Hendrix. The Electric Prunes are on here. Roger McGuinn does a couple of Bob Dylan covers. Now, they wanted to get Dylan, and Dylan said, why don't you go get Roger McGuinn? And so, anyway, McGuinn does some Dylan. Anyway, it's, again, evoking that time period, the film. Peter Fonda there, and of course the nutso Dennis Hopper, one of Jack Nicholson's very first roles. I don't know if you've ever heard about the making of this film. It was nuts. I mean, you can imagine working with Dennis Hopper and the drugs that were consumed and the fights that broke out. Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper their friendship was sort of broken for good. I think they kind of reconciled when Peter Fonda was dying or something. But yeah, it's a fascinating story in itself, the making of that. But there you go. All right, number 7. This was a film that came out in 1983, and it just hit the right chords at the time. Some of these boomers that had been the hippies and all that back in the day were getting a little older in the 80s. I remember in the 80s there were kind of like now there's kind of this nostalgia for the 80s. In the 80s there was this big nostalgia for the 60s. You know how that kind of goes in cycles. And this film kind of hit all the right chords. It takes place in the 80s, but the characters are these aging group of friends who had been, kind of the hippies in the 60s and all that, and sort of dealing with time that's passed. Anyway, it was a big movie, but the soundtrack was huge. Talking about The Big Chill. And it was so huge that they released a volume 2 of more songs from The Big Chill. And so it's a lot of music from The Big Chill. And again, these soundtracks, even if you've never seen the film, you don't have to. because I mean, there's such a kind of distinct mood. I'll just kind of look at the first album. Heard it through the grapevine from Marvin Gaye, My Girl from the Temptations, Good Lovin' from the Rascals, Tracks of My Tears, Smokey Robinson also appeared on the Platoon soundtrack. Joy to the World, Three Dog Night, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, The Temptations, Natural Woman, Aretha Franklin, Second That Emotion, another Smokey song, Wider Shade of Pale from Procol Harum, and Tell Him, The Exciters. And then on the second album, you got some CCR, some Beach Boys, Four Tops, uh, the band, The Wait. Actually, did get the song on there. Marvelettes, Spencer Davis. Wow, Quicksilver Girls, Steve Miller Band. Volume two might even be better than volume one. I always just kind of put them together. Just think of it like a double album, basically. These are all songs that were played in the movie, and yeah, that just evokes that time, or the time that those people in the film were nostalgic for, so thereby creating the nostalgia. Number 6, go back to 1977, Saturday Night Fever. Mostly the Bee Gees, but um, you got KC and the Sunshine Band on there, the Tramps, David Shire, Tavares, Yvonne Elliman, Walter Murphy, MFSB, Ralph McDonald, and a bunch of Bee Gees disco classics, right? Double album. I mean, this was obviously huge when this came out. There was the disco backlash, but as things come around, and then people now kind of appreciate some of the better disco that was made, and this is a touchstone of that. So, yeah, I mean, I just want to encapsulate that era and that genre. Here you go. Okay, 1997. This is a great, and this one a lot of you guys might not have heard because it wasn't a huge movie. It was a documentary about Muhammad Ali's in Africa, the Rumble in the Jungle against George Foreman, and it was a film called When We Were Kings. Great film. You should see the film. But at sort of around that huge boxing match, they put on this music festival. And so the soundtrack is just live material from that festival. And yeah, actually got some great pictures of Muhammad Ali here in the booklet. But let's see, where's the track listing here? Oh well, I gotta flip through here. Oh no, here it is. But well, what's cool is it has like some of those great Ali quotes that are interspersed between the songs. By Bill Withers, B.B. King, James Brown, the Spinners, Jazz Crusaders. Yeah, and some of those artists have multiple songs on here. So it's basically, like I said, it's basically the live tracks from that music festival that was going on at the same time in Africa that was accompanying this, legendary boxing match. So it's awesome, awesome. All right, number 4, 1998. Going to Wes Anderson's second film, Rushmore, and its accompanying soundtrack here. Uh, this isn't really a film video, so we're not going to get into Wes Anderson's movies. That's a whole different conversation. But man, this soundtrack, Wes Anderson uses music brilliantly in his films. I mean, even if you're not a big fan of Anderson's movies, um, the song, the music he picks perfectly, captures the mood. This is a great soundtrack because you've got some well-known artists and then some more obscure things, and even some of the well-known artists, they're not the most famous songs from those artists. So it you listen to it and it sounds pretty fresh. There's not a lot, really, none of these songs have been played to death. So it's kind of a fresh listen. Like the Kinks are on there, but Nothing in This World Can Stop Me Worrying About That Girl, which is a beautiful acoustic tune off a one of their first few records. Um, yeah, in the early to mid '60s. I drawing a blank on which record it is. It's like the second record, third record. Anyway, it's one of those early records. Um, the Who, but a quick one while he's away, right? The 8 minute. It's a live version at that. There's some songs that are better well known. The Wind by Cat Stevens, Oh Yoko from John Lennon, Ooh La La, The Faces, which is used so beautifully in that film. Uh, Creation, Making Time, a great kind of garage psychedelic tune. Some music by Mark Mothersbaugh of Devo. He actually did part of a score for it. But the soundtrack is mainly these songs that are used in the film. But yeah, just captures the whimsy of the film perfectly. And a lot of these songs are very wistful. It's a nice, not all of them. I guess the Who, a quick one while he's away isn't wistful, but a lot of Ooh La La and the Wind, yeah, and that Kinks song, yeah, great soundtrack. Okay, number three. Number three, going back to 1967. Number three, not only is it I was listening to it today, not only a great soundtrack, but it's a pioneering soundtrack because in my understanding, this really was the first um, one soundtrack of this kind to take kind of pop music and put it in a film. So I'm talking about The Graduate, of course. It's an interesting mix. Yeah, David Grusin did sort of some of the score, and that's actually great because it really captures the vibe of that film. But then, of course, why this is so famous is its use of Simon and Garfunkel's music, and and it's cool because Simon Garfunkel. I mean, some of them are just the songs, Sounds of Silence. Both versions of that appear on here. Um, it's Scarborough Fair, April Come She Will, great songs. But then Simon and Garfunkel kind of went in and re-recorded just some kind of instrumental variations on some of their songs as well, to use in the film. So it's a real, I think, landmark in soundtracks, and a great listen to. All right, number two. With this type of soundtrack, you had to get to Quentin Tarantino at some point, right? I'm going with his debut film, Reservoir Dogs. It's a great soundtrack. I mean, yeah, honorable mention. You could talk about Pulp Fiction. I really like what he did with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I don't have a hard copy of that, but it's a great soundtrack too. But I'll go with Reservoir Dogs as my pick. Similar deal he does with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's a lot of fun because he puts the soundtrack together kind of like you're listening to the radio, because in between some of the songs, there's like little kind of announcements, and the guy he gets to be the DJ on the radio, announcing songs and stuff and talking in between songs, is Stephen Wright. you know the great kind of deadpan comedian, right? And he does his Stephen Wright voice. It's just this deadpan, like no emotion, you know, DJ, and it's really fun to listen to. But then, just great picks of "Hooked on a Feeling," "Little Green Bag," "Magic Carpet Rides" on there, "Stuck in the Middle with You." Such a great song. If you like, forever tied to that torture scene in this film. If you remember the scene, Harvest Moon, Coconut, and just great choices, like not your typical choices. So again, listening to it is a really fresh listen. My number one, my favorite of this type of soundtrack. It's a film from 1995, directed by Tim Robbins, the actor, but also directed. Dead Man Walking. This, I think, is so brilliant. One, look at the artists he got. So got all these artists, and I believe these are all like newly written songs for this film. I don't know if you remember this movie. Sean Penn's in it, right? It's basically about the death penalty and death row and all that kind of thing. True story. Whatever. I'm not going to get into the politics of that. But all of these songs are basically thematic in some way connected to that topic, to being in prison or on death row or whatever, facing death. And the people that he got to do these songs, it just hits it out of the park. And in the people, and then these artists really hit it out of the park. Bruce Springsteen does the title track, Johnny Cash, Suzanne Vega, Lyle Lovett, Eddie Vedder, Tom Waits, Mary Chapin Carpenter, Patti Smith, Steve Earle, Michelle Shocked. I mean, and by and large, each of these artists contribute really good songs. Um, it's kind of a depressing songs, but in some ways it's beautiful because it's also musically it's similar. Most of this stuff is very kind of spare and acoustic, and so it works. It's kind of a real coherent, cohesive sound. I think this is a pretty brilliant soundtrack. Especially of this type we're talking about, where it's collections of songs instead of like a score, so to speak. Yeah, that's it. Well, anyway, that's my list. Let me give you, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these honorable mentions here. Ones that almost made it. This is just a nostalgia thing. But hey, this captures the time. Now, this is television. TV shows have soundtracks too. Miami Vice soundtrack, right? Jan Hammer, that Miami Vice theme. Then a couple of, I think, great songs from Glenn Frey, right? Smuggler's Blues and You Belong to the City. Tina Turner's Better Be Good to Me. Phil Collins In the Air Tonight. It kind of captures that vibe. This one was huge. I'll mention this one. If you remember the Oh Brother, Where Art Thou soundtrack. For what it's trying to do, it's really great. Kind of bringing together a lot of that sort of roots country Americana stuff. Yeah, yeah. I listened to it all that much. Robert Rodriguez kind of sort of followed a lot of the Quentin Tarantino template, especially on soundtracks. The Desperado soundtrack is pretty great. Los Lobos does a lot of the music for it. But it was a great Dire Straits song on there, Six Blade Knife. Um, where is it? There's Link Ray, Jack the Ripper, and a lot of Los Lobos stuff. Some of it is a score, but some of it's songs. Yeah. Anyway, kind of cool, but obviously with a Latin edge to it. And God, was Salma Hayek beautiful? Yeah, gorgeous. All right. Anyway, that's the main thing I remember about that film. All right. And I got one real quirky one as an honorable mention. Some of you may have heard of this movie, Where the Buffalo Roam. That's Bill Murray right there. Where the Buffalo Roam, where Bill Murray plays Hunter S. Thompson. This is an interesting soundtrack. It's got Neil Young's very involved in it. Neil Young actually does some kind of a little bit of a score for it, but Purple Haze, Jimi Hendrix is on here. Keep on Chuglin from CCR. Um, there's some Four Tops. There's Highway 61 from Bob Dylan. Um, Temptations are on there. All Along the Watchtower, Jimi Hendrix again. And then Neil Young does a bunch of kind of instrumental stuff, which is interesting. It's kind of off the beaten path. You got to kind of be a Neil Young junkie like I am, where I have to have everything he's done. But it works as a pretty cool soundtrack too. That's what it is. I think I just hit the camera. Oh, now we're like tilted slightly. Anyway, we're done anyway. So, what do you guys think? In the comments, What are some great soundtracks that are kind of more collections of songs versus a score, like we talked about last episode? And let's talk these type of soundtracks. Well, all right, guys, please do subscribe. We appreciate it. Hit the bell for notifications, like the videos, all of that stuff, and we'll see you next time.